Hello friends, so very warm welcome. This is Ishan on behalf of Edureka. So we are supposed to discuss some interview questions related to the Spring Framework for the day. So let's begin the session, and I hope the session will help you and guide you to prepare for your interview. So best of luck, right? So best wishes. Let's start and let's see what we have got for you. So what exactly is basically the Spring Framework in the market? So let's have a look on to first, right? So guys, Spring Source was the company created by the founders of the Spring Framework, right? And it merged into Covalent in January 29, 2008. So Spring Source was purchased by VMware for approximately $420 million in 2009, right? So this is something where we are trying to come up with some history. So Spring's dominance over the years has increased, right? And it basically is having one monopoly in the field of web frameworks, specifically in Java Enterprise Edition. So Spring Framework plays one important role. So you can see a significant increase from 2012 to 2016 in the market, right? So if you can see, so Spring MVC is one of the most interesting part over here. If you can see, it has the maximum respondents available. So let's see some job trends when it comes to Spring Framework. So in a country like India, we have somehow demand, right? So it's like more of demand in India. And if you can see various job portals, so an approximate average is nearly 3,000, right? So in a similar way, we got the trends in US as well, right? So again, so US is approximately on an average level of 6,000, right? So we are trying to come up and show you guys that Spring Framework is really into the market, and we got a lot of job openings available into the Spring Framework. So this data is approximately 18th May 2017. So again, if you can see some more trends coming in. So we got the permanent jobs versus the contract jobs, right? So the graph is rising, so it's not falling off, right? So as the years increase, right? So this graph is constantly going up, right? It's not coming down. So again, the data we have taken from the various job portals. So let's see what we have gotten for the day. So we will be discussing general questions with respect to the Spring Framework, and we'll see the dependency injection and inversion of control, right? So here I'll try to demonstrate a couple of concepts for you practically as well. Thereafter, we'll see the beans in the Spring Framework, how we can, rather than coming up with the configuration XML files, we can use annotations. Then what is your data access layer, where you can integrate your JDBC or Hibernate with the Spring Framework. Then we'll move on to aspect-oriented programming, and in the end, we'll have one introduction to Spring MVC. So guys, let's start with the first one. That's like the Spring Framework. Now this is very basic question when you are going to start with interview, right? So the technical. So what do you know about Spring Framework, or what exactly is Spring Framework? Now that's like the primary question which you might face. So in an introductory part, so what you can come up with is, so it's a lightweight framework which basically focuses on loose coupling. So when I say coupling, it means less dependencies, right? And it's an integrated framework which is created to address the complexity of enterprise application development. So majorly you are going to come up with the Spring Framework when you are writing an enterprise level application, right? And other than that, it's a layered architecture. So we can be selective about what and all components we wish to use, right? And thereafter, it's going to provide us a cohesive environment for our application development in Java Enterprise Edition. So let's see the advantages of Spring Framework, right? So what can be the various advantages if you want to come up with a Spring Framework? So number one, it's a layered architecture. So here we got Bean, Model, or Tojo. That's like plain old Java object-based programming. Then there are two powerful features in the core layer of Spring Framework. That's like dependency injection and inversion of control. So we don't have the control in the hands of our program. So this objects, they will be created by the Spring container, right? So inversion of control means you don't create the objects, you configure the objects, and objects will be constructed by the Spring Framework. So again, it's an open source community, so no vendors are coming in, no licensing coming in. So that's one of the major advantage of using any of the technology, right, which is open source. Now coming on to the features, so it's lightweight, right? So when I say lightweight, it means we got memory optimizations. Then we got inversion of control. We got the control of object construction to the destruction. The entire life cycle will be managed by the Spring container. We got aspect-oriented programming, which is going to help us in writing the cross-cutting concerns, for example, security. Then we got a built-in container, and we got MVC framework. So we got a available snippet as in MVC, so which is model view controller as a design pattern. Then we got transaction management and database handling part, right? So JDBC, etc. and etc. We can do a lot of things in data access layer of our Spring framework. So let's see what and all are the modules available in the Spring framework and what exactly they are, right? So guys, Spring framework is a layered architecture. So it's basically a layered architecture. So layers can interact with each other, right? So in the upper direction, the lower direction. So the rock bottom layer is a testing layer. That's like you can have JUnit testing, or you can have unit testing using JUnit. Even you can have integration testing, right? Then we got the core container, which is the core of the Spring framework, right? So here we're gonna play with the beans, core, context, and Spring expression language. Thereafter we got AOP, that's like aspect oriented programming, then aspects, instrumentation, and messaging. In the data access layer, we got ORM, that's like object relationship mapping, right? And other tools are also available. And in the web layer, we got WebSocket, web framework, servlets. So it's basically a framework of frameworks now, right? So we got a lot of frameworks available within the single framework. Now, one of the major thing which is a core of our Spring framework is the configuration file. Now this is an XML file, right, where we will be configuring the values for the attributes of an object, right? So where we are talking about inversion of control, you are supposed to configure your objects in an XML file. Spring container will read this Spring configuration file and will construct the objects for us. Now that's like inversion of control. So let us see the different components available in the Spring application. So guys, we got an interface that will define the functions, right? The implementation that contains the properties like you can say a student is one, a kind of a class which contains the attributes like a roll number, name, standard, age, etc., along with the getters, setters, or any other methods, right? So we got aspect oriented programming, and we got the Spring configuration, which is an XML file, and we need to have a client program where we're gonna use our Spring container and we'll be using the objects constructed by it, right? So that's like some various components of any Spring application. So what are the major versions for the Spring framework? So guys, we got 2.5, right? So this guy is having annotation driven configuration, right? So which is possible in this 2.5. So before 2.5 we were not having the annotational supports available. Then in 3.0, so the use of Java 5 improvements in the language, right? So we got some enhancements in the language itself. So in 4.0, it's like the first version which fully supports all the Java features, right? So that's like the latest version even in the market. So what are the various ways how we can use this Spring framework, right? So the different ways of using the Spring framework. So we can have full-fledged Spring web application, that's like through model view controller. We can have a middle tier that can provide the help of a third-party web framework. Then we can use it if we are supposed to do any remote invocations. Then we got enterprise Java beans, so wrapping up the existing plain old Java objects, right? So that's like some of the different ways in which we can come up with a Spring framework. So let's now focus on the core part of the Spring framework, that's like dependency injection and inversion of control, right? So what exactly is this IOC? So guys, inversion of control over here means that you don't create the objects. Objects will be constructed by the Spring framework, right? And we got IOC container which will do so. So we're gonna wire the objects, right? We're gonna configure them in an XML file. Management of the entire life cycle from construction till destruction will be taken care by this guy IOC container. We can also come up with dependency injection like features where we can punch in the dependent data, or you can say that we got a relationship like person has an address, right? So person is one object and address is the other object. So having a dependency of address object and person object, on each other, we can come up with this dependency injection technique where we can fulfill this criteria, right? So it is basically for has a relation which has to be fulfilled. So what do you mean by dependency injection? So guys, DI over here means that we don't create objects but describe how they should be created. Now that's like the basic inversion of control feature, right? So we don't directly connect the components and services in the code. So we need to come up with the configuration in the XML file itself, right? So dependency injection is done in your XML structure itself. So we got a container which is responsible for doing it, right? So we got Spring container which will do so. So how many ways this dependency injection can be done? So guys, we got three different ways of doing it. We can have constructor based injection, right? So it means that you're gonna come up with constructors, then we can have setter injection, then we can also have interface injection. So let's try to see what exactly we are intending over here. Consider that you got one class as person, right? And person can have one, let's say ID, person can have an email, then person can have some age, right? And we can have many other attributes, right? So these are the attributes for person. Now we got one more class known as address. So when I'm going to come up with the address, so address can have its own attributes. So for example, you can have a city, right? We can have one address line. Then you can also come up with some state, right? So you can have a country, you can have a zip code, so on and so forth, right? So these are the attributes available in my address. Now we need to come up with one relationship that person has an address. So this is one has a relationship which we have created. So person has an address. So that is what we are trying to come up with. So guys, when there is a has a relationship, then we are talking of dependency. So this is dependency now, right? So what we can do now, we can have a person constructor where we can say address as in a new address, right? So let's talk of very general thing, and in some client class where we'll have this guy main method. So I'm not writing, I'm just trying to do it in a pseudo way. So let's say we are going to come up and we are saying person P as in a new person, right? So I'm going to create one new person, and when the constructor of the person will be executed, at that time the object of address will be created. It means that there exists a very high dependency that address object can be constructed only when the person object will be constructed. So such a dependency is leading to very high coupling, right? So we got a concept where person object, when it will be constructed, only then the address object will be constructed. So this is one problem statement, and we need to find out a solution for this. To find out the solution, we will not do it like this. We'll come down and we'll try to create one constructor, and we'll pass one address, and we'll say copy the A into address. Or what we will say, we'll say let's create one setter like set address, and here we can have an address as in A, right? So this is what we would rather intend to do. So benefit of this will become like, you can say address A as in a new address, and thereafter you can say P dot set the address as in A, or in the other ways you can say person Q as a new person, and here in the constructor you can pass the guy A. So this is like how you are resolving the dependency. So address object is constructed separately, person object is constructed separately. So you can set the address either through a setter method, or you can pass it as an input to the constructor as per your will. So we are trying to come up with constructor injection and setter injection in the configuration file linked with these two key concepts, right? So we call this as dependency, and here we have resolved the problem of high coupling. We have reduced the coupling level, and we call it like we have solved one problem where dependency was very high. So let's now proceed and understand. So either you can do it by constructor or setter, or you can even do it through interfaces, right? So if you want to come up with some polymorphic concept, and if you want to come up with some, you know, runtime logics, you can also write interfaces. So it's going to be more flexible in our programs. So what exactly is the difference? I hope one of the key concept is very well clear now. So what is constructor and setter based dependency resolution? So in constructor there is no partial injection, but in setter you can do a partial injection, right? So here we don't override the setter property, but here you need to come up with the setter property defined very well. So it will create new instances if any modification is done, right? So here you can't come up without an object, right? So you need an object for sure, but here you can skip that and you can do it later. So it is better for too many properties, and if we got few properties, you can always use the setter injection, right? So these are some differences between constructor and setter injection. All right, so how many types of IOC containers are there in the Spring framework? So guys, there are two major containers in the Spring framework of IOC layer. So we got application context and bean factory, right? So guys, bean factory is basically one container, right? And application context is implementation, and it's built on top of bean factory itself. So it is always better to come up with application context rather than the bean factory. So let us try to differentiate between bean factory and application context, and let's try to write one program and see how we can do so, right? So let's see one program. So let's create one new Java project, and I'm going to name it like my Spring demo, right? So let's say next, and let's say finish. So it's one project in Java which I have created, and within my src directory, what I'm going to do, I'm going to create one class, and this class is going to go under the package _Edureka. And since we are on to interview questions, let's think of employee class, right? So let's say finish. So here we are with the employee. I'm going to come up with one employee ID, right? So that's like the attributes. Then we can have a name of the employee. I can have some salary associated with the employee, right? Let's say we got department for the employee. And finally, if you want, you can have, let's say, an email. Right, so we can have a lot of attributes. So these are a few of the attributes which I have taken. Now we can create one constructor, right? So let's write one constructor. So it's a default one. So here I will just say CISO employee object constructed, right? So let's say employee object constructed. So coming up with next, I can write source and then getters and setters, right? So let's write getters and setters for our class. So select all and say okay. So here we are with the getters and setters, and finally I will generate one two-string method, right? So let's say a two-string method. So this is my employee class which is written, and we say that this is a Pojo or bean or model, right? So you can use any terminology. right? So Pojo is a plain old Java object. Let's come back and let's try to write one more class. And here I'm going to say a client class with the main method. So in the client class with the main method, so what is the traditional way of creating the objects, or what is the a general way of creating the object, right? So general way of creating the objects, it goes like you say an employee as in a new employee, right? So this is the reference to the employee object. So I can say eref dot set of name. For example, it goes like John. You say eref dot set of, let's say, EID as 101. So guys, these are some regular ways of creating the objects, right? So eref dot, let's say, set of department. So I'm going to say it's like R&D. Then let's say set of salary, which is like 45,000. Then you say eref dot set of email, which goes like john@example.com. Now this is one traditional way or general way how we construct an object. Now if I say CISO of eref details plus eref, so if I print out the eref, it's gonna call the toString method, and here you will see, let's run it as a Java application. So you'll see it says employee object constructed, and these are the details available in my employee object. Now this is one general way or traditional way how you construct the objects. But we need to understand how the objects are constructed using the Spring framework. To do so, the very first thing which I am going to do is I'm going to link the jar files, right? So how I will do that? I will do right click and I will say build path and I will say configure my build path, right? So when I say configure the build path, I will be in my libraries and I'm going to say add external jars. So let's add the Spring jars. So guys, I got this Spring jars available over here. So we need to add the core layer jars, right? So I'm using the Spring core over here. So I'm going to add these core jar files and then say apply, and you can say okay. So here you can see the referenced jars available for your Spring framework. Now the next part is to come up with some XML configuration file in your SRC directory. To do so, what I'm going to do, I have it with me. So let me open that. So I'm here with this employee bean.xml. So I'm going to copy this XML file and I'm going to paste it in my SRC directory. So point to be noted is that this is pasted in SRC directory but not in the package. So in my SRC directory, this employee bean.xml, it looks like this. So it's basically one XML configuration file. The root tag is beans and we got the tag as bean. So I'm going to say bean ID is E1 and class is co.edureka.employee. So fully qualified a name of my class, it comes up like co.edureka.employee and the ID is E1. Now we got few properties available over here: EID, name, salary, department, and email, right? So let's start with EID. So we got EID, then you got name, salary, department, and email, right? So EID, name, salary, department, and email. So we got EID, name, salary, department, and email. So I have mentioned these properties. So what are the values which you want to set into them? So I will say 1 or 2. The name goes like Jenny and salary goes like, let's say, somewhere around 50,000. Department is HR and email is Jenny@example.com, right? So here we are, guys. So now you can configure as many as objects you want in your XML file. So let's configure one more. Let's say the ID is E2. Now the ID should be unique, right? So this ID goes like 201 and the name goes like George. So George is having a 57,000 and this guy belongs to admin, and let's say the email ID goes like george@example.com, right? So this is one of the configuration files which we must have in our Spring project, right? So what we got a Pojo class, we got a configuration file, we got the jar files, and we got a client class to test our program. So let's see the Spring way. So the Spring way goes like, with the help of a concept known as inversion of control, right? So what exactly is this term, inversion of control? So guys, in inversion of control, I am going to give this right to my Spring container. So let's see the first container. So I'm going to say the first container over here as bean factory. So let's see how to use this guy, bean factory. First of all, I'll come up with one API known as resource from Spring framework, right? If it's from the Spring framework, you say resource as in a new class path resource, and here I will say my employee bean.xml. So this is your XML configuration file, right? So if you can see over here, so this XML configuration file, it goes into the class path resource, and thereafter you say bean factory, and let's say factory as in a new XML bean factory from the resource. So guys, this is how we use our first guy, that's like bean factory, right? So this is my first container. So it's a Spring IOC container. So what's bean factory? It's a Spring IOC container. So this guy is responsible to construct objects for us. Now I'm just going to run the code. So when I run the code, so nothing happens, just this relevant information is displayed. Now what we need to observe over here. So when I'm executing the code, Spring framework, the container, that's like bean factory, is not constructing an object for us. But as soon as I will say employee emp1 as in factory dot get the bean on the basis of E1, right? So here if you can see, we got the guy as E1, right? And you need to typecast it back to the employee. So when you call its method getBean, at that very instance, now when I'm going to run the code, right? So you can see employee object constructed. Only one object is constructed, right? So if you try to get the second guy as in E2, and when you run the code again, you will find that both the objects are constructed. So bean factory, what it is doing, it constructs the objects when we request. That's like the Spring IOC container bean factory. So it constructs the object when we request. Now you can just say a CISO on emp1 as well as emp2, right? So here we are. So let's run the code and you can see the details coming in. So guys, this is the first bean factory as in your IOC container, right? So let's see the second guy, that's like application context. So it's also a Spring framework container, right? And let's see how it's gonna come up. So it constructs the objects even when we do not request. So let's see how it's gonna do so. So I'll comment out the above code and let's see the application context in action. So I'll say application context as in a new class path XML application context, and here you mention this guy employee bean.xml. Now it is very much equivalent to whatever we have done before. Now I'm just going to run the code, right? So when I run the code, I can see both the employee objects are constructed even though I have not requested for any object. Now that's one of the significant difference which you can see over here, right? As in the practical environment. So if you don't request, even then it's gonna create, and if you are trying to request, so you request it in the same way, so the way you were requesting it before. So guys, if you don't want to typecast it over here, you can just come down and you can say comma employee dot class, right? So you can mention the type over here. So that's the second way. So both the cases it's gonna work, right? So you can mention it over here even, right? And you can just leave this from this side. So here again, so both the concepts they're gonna give you the same outcome, but the object construction, if you can see, right, application context will construct the objects even if you don't request for them. Now that's like one practical example how we are able to demonstrate both the concepts. So let's see more of the differences between both of them. So that was a quick introduction to the Spring framework, right? What is inversion of control. So guys, being packed in application context, so here we got lazy initialization and there we got aggressive initialization. Now that relevant concept I think is very well clear whatever we have demonstrated. So in Bean Factory, explicitly provided a resource object using the syntax where here every resources are managed by its own. So internationalization is not supported in Bean Factory, whereas application context does. So application annotation based dependency injection is not supported by Bean Factory, whereas application context will support. Now that's also one of the major differences. So some of the benefits of IOC. So guys, IOC will minimize the amount of code in application because you will have one XML configuration file. So anytime if you want to change, so you can change the configuration, right? So it's very easy to test our application and coupling can be, you know, reduced. So it can be a loose coupling concept which we can promote, and hence there will be least intrusive mechanisms with minimal efforts, right? So IOC containers, they're gonna support eager instantiation and lazy loading kind of services for you. Let's see now what are Spring Beans. So guys, bean is nothing. It's your Java object which we have seen already in our program, right? So the metadata is provided in the XML file. Container will create an object for you. So that's like your basic bean object. So this configuration metadata can be given in an XML file. It can also be supplied through an annotation based configuration, or it can be even a Java based configuration. So there are three main models how you can configure your objects as in your IOC concept. Now what can be the various scopes which can be supported by the Spring framework? So what is meant by this scope, right? So let's try to understand this part. So guys, our scope over here means when you are writing your employee bean, right? So here you can mention a scope. So scope can go like singleton, which means for your entire application there will be only single object. Scope can go like prototype. So by default it is singleton, right? So when you say prototype, every time a new object will be constructed for you. So if you want to see a difference, let's see one difference, right? So I'm going to say the scope is singleton in my client. So I'm going to work on E1, right? So in my employee.java, so here in the toString method, I'm going to say plus super.toString, right? So I'll put one \n and I will say object address super.toString. So in my client, when I'm going to run the code, you will also find that, all right, so I think I didn't printed it. So let's say CISO of AMP1, right? So when I'm going to say AMP1, so it will now say the address is 21BCFFB5, right? So there is one object which is constructed at this memory location. Now let us try to write one AMP2, which is again we are requesting E1, right? So you are requesting only E1. So again I am going to print AMP2, and now you will find that both of the objects are same, right? You can see the address. So that is where we got the guy as singleton. Let's change this to prototype. So I'm going to change it to prototype. Now let's rerun the code, and here now you will find that this is a separate address and this is a separate address. So that's like the scopes within your beans, right? So scope within your beans can be singleton, prototype, request, session, or a global session. Request is for one HTTP request, session is throughout one HTTP session, and global session is valid in the context of a web-aware Spring application context, right? So what is the bean lifecycle? So guys, we also have a lifecycle of a bean, right? So what does this mean now? Spring Framework, you got this entire life cycle management happening by the Spring IOC container itself. So the bean's gonna get instantiated, then its property is gonna get populated through setter methods, right? So setter methods are going to get called, right? And any post processor, if you want to come up, you got a bean post processor API. So we can have after properties being set, and custom init and custom destroy can also be implemented, like we have seen my init and my destroy. So we can also have post initialization, like we got a post processor over here. And once the bean is ready to use, you can use it. And once container is shut down, so custom destroy method is executed. So what are inner beans? So guys, inner beans are like if you have a person, right, as has a relationship in student, right? So you can come up with the inner bean. So you can have a bean property, and then you can also create one inner bean, and you can set its properties over here. So what is bean wiring? So guys, bean wiring is something, right, which means that beans are combined together with the Spring container. So when we are wiring the beans, the Spring container must know what beans are required and how the container should use dependency injection to tie them together, right? So what are the different modes to wire the beans? So guys, we got by number, by name, by type, constructor, and auto detect. So these are the different ways through which you can bind them. So what can be the limitations if you are going to come with auto wiring? So guys, the possibility of overriding is there, right? And then primitive data types, it becomes complicated, it's challenging, and it's again confusing in nature, right? So you need to remember what was the name over there and what has to be kept over here, right? So it's a bit confusing. All right, so we got Spring annotations. So guys, the way we got XML configuration, in a similar way we can have annotation, right? So you can mention @ configuration or @ bean. So these are the different annotational based configurations for your Spring IOC container. So how we can come up with the annotation wiring? So if you are supposed to come up with annotation wiring, you must support context : annotation config. You must write this property in your XML file, right? So how you can do so? So you need to come up over here and you need to say context : annotation config. So if you are going to support your annotations, you must follow this standard. All right, so let's now see what are exactly the different annotations which are quite used in commercial or in industry. So we got component, controller, repository, and service. So these are kind of most used annotations. So guys, component is basically a generic stereotype, right, which can be used across the application. Controller is to represent your business part. Service will annotate classes on the service level layer, and repository is going to deal with the database part. So what is this @ required annotation? So guys, when we are coming up with a bean construction, @ required is a kind of, you can say, one constraint, right? So name has to be populated for sure, else it's gonna throw a bean initialization exception. So that's like you can say putting up the constraints. So @ auto wired annotation is basically auto wiring, right? So let's say you got an employee, right, and we got this guy name. So you can put it as in @ auto wired. So auto wiring here by name. So you need not to come up with a different dependency injection technique. You need to use the same name. So what is this guy qualifier? So guys, there are some situations when you're gonna create more than one bean for the same type, but we want to wire only any one out of them with a property. So we can use qualifier annotation along with auto wiring so that we can remove this ambiguous nature, right? So qualifier is used so that you can mention which bean is supposed to be auto wired, right? In case you have multiple constructions for the same guy. Now we got request mapping annotation. So this annotation is particularly for your HTTP request. Now we are trying to come something known as the web part of the Spring Framework. So @ request mapping annotation, it can be applied at both the levels. So class level and method level. So in class level method, it's going to map the URL request, whereas on the method level, it's going to also take care of HTTP method, right? So HTTP method can be either get, post, delete, put, trace, any methods, right? So these methods can be taken care. So let's see what is the data access layer. So guys, Spring comes with the data access support, right? So we got all DAO as a design pattern concept which can be, used of in our Spring framework. So Spring framework data access is aimed at making it easy to work with the data access technologies like Hibernate, Ebatis, JDBC or JDO, right? Java data objects. So it's very easy to switch between the persistent technologies. So you can switch from one of the framework to the other framework very easily. So code without worrying about catching the exceptions that are specific to each technology. So you can write a very beautiful independent code. So what are the various exceptions? So guys, we got data access exception as the root, right? So there are various subclasses to this exception now. So if you can see there is one whole hierarchy. In a similar way, the basic core Java concept, if you talk about the standard edition, you got throwable coming out with exception, and then you are having a complete exception hierarchy as in runtime exceptions, checked versus unchecked, etc., etc. So here we got a complete hierarchy coming in, right? So you need not to remember that, but you should always remember that there exists one paid exception class. So what and all classes are present in the Spring JDBC API? So guys, we got JDBC template, simple JDBC template, named parameter JDBC template. So we got simple JDBC insert, simple JDBC call. So these are some major important APIs with respect to your JDBC. So JDBC template is again used on a very frequent basis. So how we can use Hibernate and Spring framework? So guys, there are two ways. So either you can do an inversion of control with the Hibernate template API, or you can extend the Hibernate DAO support and you can use AOP. That's like aspect oriented programming. So what are the types of transactions, transaction management, right? Types which Spring framework supports. So guys, there are two things. One is programmatic transaction management and declarative transaction management. So many times you as a developer might be confused over here. So transaction is managed with the help of programming in programmatic transaction management. So here we got an extreme flexibility, right? But maintenance is a bit difficult part. But in declarative part, so transaction management is not a part of your programming. So it's basically annotations or XML based configuration to manage your transaction. Now that's the core difference. So declarative means either annotational based or XML based. So different ORMs are supported by the Spring framework, right? So that all of the major ORMs, right? Any relationship mapping for the object framework. So most importantly, we got Hibernate and Ebatis, which are used. Even JPA is also one of the core concepts. So now let's see Spring AOP. So guys, AOP stands for aspect oriented programming. Now this is one technique which allows the programmers to modularize cross-cutting concerns. So what is meant by the cross-cutting concern, we'll see in our upcoming slides. So we can also modularize the behavior that's going to cut across the typical divisions of responsibility. Now the core construct of the AOP is known as an aspect, right? So which encapsulates different behaviors affecting multiple classes into some reusable modules. So we got a base or a core program, we got an aspect, and thereafter you're gonna weave them together to get a final system, right? So let's try to understand it in more detail. What exactly is this guy aspect? So guys, an aspect is basically a modularization of a concern that cuts across multiple objects, right? So we got a source method and a target method. So when we are going to call the method, so this aspect will have one point cut and one joint cut. So what is this guy concern? So guys, for example, security is one concern, right? So that's like fulfilled by aspect. So let's see what is this join point. So when you are going to execute a method, so if you can see in the method execution, you got various join points, right? So a point during the execution of a program, such as the execution of a method or handling of any exception, right? It is known as a join point. So in Spring AOP, a join point always represents a method execution, right? So any point in the method execution is referred to as a join point. So advice is something which is an action taken by an aspect at any particular join point, right? So for any particular join point, we got an advice, right, within an aspect. So there can be around, before, and after. So what happens before the method execution, what happens after the method execution, what happens around the method execution, right? So let's try to take one example over here. If you are going to log into the Amazon, right? So you are going to come up with one request. So at what time you're going to log in? So that's like before, right? And what time you log out? That's like the after. So you take it like one method execution as one interval where you are surfing around the Amazon, and that's like around, right? So that's one key example. So many AOP frameworks, we got model and advice as an interceptor, and we need to maintain various chain of interceptors around the join point. So let's see the different advices. So we got before and after, right? So this is like coming up before the method execution and after the method execution. Similarly, we got around the method execution. We got after returning and after throwing as well. So this is quite linked with exceptions now. So let's point out the difference between concern and cross-cutting concern. So guys, what is a concern? Concern is a behavior we want to have in a module of an application, whereas a cross-cutting concern is a concern which is applicable throughout the application. For example, security. From writing your code to maintenance to execution, you need the security on every level, right? So that's like your cross-cutting concern. So what exactly are the different AOP implementations? So guys, we got Spring AOP, Apache Aspect J, and JBoss AOP. So these are the various AOP implementations available in the market. So let's differentiate between Spring AOP and Aspect J AOP. So guys, Spring AOP, we got weaving through proxy, right? Here we got weaving through Aspect J within the Java tools. So AOP in the Spring will support only method level point cut, whereas in Aspect J AOP, even the field level point cuts are also possible. So we got DTD based, so it's like document type definition, right? And Aspect J is schema based or annotational configuration again. So what is this proxy all about? So guys, what happens whenever you create an object? So after applying an advice to a target object, right? So in respect to the client objects, any target and the proxy object, they are the same. So you got an advice and you got a target object. So in overall, you get a proxy, right? So that's like what the proxy is intended to. So what is meant by this guy weaving? Whenever an aspect is going to be linked with application types or any object which has to be created as an advice object. So this particular concept, we call it as weaving, right? So this can be performed on 3 instances, either at compilation time or at runtime or even at the time of loading, right? So guys, in Spring Framework, when you are doing the weaving weaving process, it is performed always at runtime, right? So you need to call up for your proxy, for your target, and this particular weaving will be taken care at runtime. So it's all dynamic. So lastly, we got Spring MVC. That's like model view controller. So guys, the Spring MVC framework helps us to work in a predefined model view controller architecture. So we got ready to use components which will help us to develop flexible and loosely coupled web application. So we got different aspects of the application which are separated now. So you can see over here, we got dispatcher servlet as one of the key important ingredient. We got the mapping, handler mapping, controller, view resolver, and view. So these are the various components. Let's see what are these guys. So guys, dispatcher servlet is the one which will handle any HTTP request or response. So Spring MVC framework is designed around the dispatcher servlet only. So what is this web application context? So web application context is again an extension of application context. So application context is the core container, whereas web application context is a container on the web app layer, right? So this will have an extra feature for your web applications. So it is also capable of resolving some themes, and it knows which servlet is associated to which kind of resource, right? So that's like your web application context. So what is this guy controller? So guys, controller is going to act as a receptionist. So whenever any new request will come from the user, it will go to the controller, and thereafter controller is gonna process the data from the model, and then it's gonna give the view back to the user, right? So Spring controller is going to act as a receptionist now, right, where it's gonna handle your requests. So that's like the whole agenda for the day. So guys, if you are going to come up with any Spring interview, right, you need to follow these topics. You need to prepare these topics so that you can crack your interviews, right? So that's all from my side and Edureka. So we wish you all the very best, and we hope that you do well in your interviews. So thank you very much. All the best. Rise and shine. Thank you very much, guys. Bye-bye.